Good morning, fifth grade, and welcome to your math lesson for today's e-learning day, January the 12th, 2018. We are continuing in our study of adding and subtracting mixed fractions. So today I'm just going to review one of the strategies that we first looked at yesterday. I have my question here, I have my coffee, so we are ready to go. So when we are adding mixed fractions, I have one example here already, like 4 3/5 plus 6 6/10. We have different denominators. So we need to use our strategy for adding these mixed fractions before we can actually do the addition. So one of the tricks that we've learned is that we can separate the whole numbers, our 4 and our 6, from our fraction parts, the 3/5 and the 6/10, and then find the sum of these two separate parts and then put everything together in the end. So let's go ahead and do that first part where we pull together those whole numbers, 4 and 6, and then we pull together the fraction parts that are in our question, the 3/5 and the 6/10. So now we're just going to find the answers to each of those two parts, and then we'll combine them back together again in the end. So if we add our whole numbers first, we have 4 plus 6, and we all know this is 10. And then we have our 3/5 plus our 6/10. Since our denominators are not the same, that means we have to use a strategy for making equivalent fractions. One of those strategies is to do the butterfly. So I'm just going to do the butterfly here. So 5 times 6 is 30. This is also called cross multiplication. Okay, and 10 times 3 is also 30. Okay, and then for our common denominator, we multiply our denominators 5 and 10, and we get 50. Okay, now as you know, there's always other ways of finding these equivalent fractions. This is just one of those strategies. So we're going to go ahead now and we add our new numerators. So we have 30 plus 30, which is 60. And our new common denominator is 50. And as fifth graders, we know that we need to reduce any fraction that we have. So I'm looking at 60 and 50, and I need to think of a number that they both have in common. Well, I know they end in zeros, so they are both even, and I could divide by 2, because they both will have 2 in common. But they end in zeros, so that means they have a bigger number in common, and that is 10. So I am going to reduce this using 10. So I look at 60 divided by 10 and 50 divided by 10. And that, 60 divided by 10 is 6, and 50 divided by 10 is 5. When we look at this fraction, it's an improper fraction, which means I have to do one more reducing. Since the 6 is bigger than the 5, that means that we can use our division to figure out how to turn 6/5 into a mixed number rather than an improper fraction. So we take our 6, we see how many times 5 will divide into 6. Well, I know 5 will go into 6 one time. 1 times 5 is 5. We subtract, and 6 minus 5 is 1. Do our candy cane method to figure out our answer. Shoop. So our answer is 1 whole and 1/5. So this means that our answer to the 3/5 plus 6/10 is 1 and 1/5. So, like I said before, we're going to pull out those whole numbers and find the answer to that. And we're going to pull out the fractions and find the answer to that. And then we have to combine both of these answers together. So we ask ourselves, what is 6 plus 1 and 1, or sorry, what is 10 plus 1 and 1/5? Well, our answer should be 11 and 1/5. And this does seem reasonable because if I'm estimating, 4 plus 6 is 10. 3/5 is a little bit more than a half. 6/10 is a little bit more than a half. So if I add something that's a half plus a half, I'm going to have 1 whole. So that will increase this answer by 1. But they're both a little bit bigger than a half, so that means I'm going to have a little bit more. And 1/5 is really just a little bit. It's closest to 0 than it is to a half. So this answer does seem reasonable. Okay, so that is how we would add mixed fractions that have different denominators. Now, one of the other topics we're looking at today is subtracting mixed fractions. And I also have an example for us to work out today using our same strategy. So we're going to do the same type of problem, 5 1/2 minus 2 1/10. So we have 2 different denominators, which means we can't just subtract them the way they are. We have to make equivalent fractions. So we're going to pull out our whole numbers, and our whole numbers are 5 minus 2, and then we're going to pull out our 2 fractions that we have, 1/2 minus 1/10. And it's very important that you write these fractions in the same order because it is 1/2 subtract 1/10. So that means we have to continue that same order in our fractions when we pull them out. We have to subtract 1/10 from 1/2. Okay, so now we are going to go ahead and start solving both of these parts to find our answers. The difference of 5 and 2 is 3. Now we need to find our difference between 1/2 and 1/10. Since our denominators are different, well, that means we need to find equivalent fractions with the same denominator before we can subtract. Now you may know equivalent fractions right off the bat, and you could just replace your fractions, like you could replace 1/2 with something that is equivalent to tenths. However, the other method that always works, if you're not sure, is the butterfly. So we'll just get our butterfly wings here, get ourselves set up. So 2 times 1 is 2, and 10 times 1 is 10. And then we'll get our new common denominator. 2 times 10 is 20. So now our new question is the same as, switch markers here. Our new question would be the same as 10 20ths, right? So 10 20ths is the same as equivalent to 1/2 minus 2 20ths, because 2 20ths is equivalent to 1/10. Now, when we are subtracting fractions, the one step we have to do that's different from adding these fractions is we have to look at the 2 fractions and make sure that we don't have to regroup. Sometimes we have to borrow. So we want to look at our fractions. Now, if the first fraction, in this case 10 20ths, is larger than our second fraction, in this case 2 20ths, we know that we can just go ahead and subtract. If this fraction were not larger, then we would have to go borrow from our whole number. So let's take a look. 10 20ths. Well, as we said before, that's equal to 1/2. Now, 2 20ths is obviously much smaller, so we can subtract here without having to borrow or regroup. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract. 10 take away 2 is 8, and our new denominator is 20, so we have 8 20ths. Okay, and then in 5th grade, we know we need to reduce or simplify our fractions to lowest terms, so we're going to look for a number that both 8 and 20 have in common. Now, it's always easy to kind of start with 2 and then work our way up to get to larger and larger factors. So if I look at 2, both 8 and 20 are even numbers, which means I can divide both of these by 2. So I'm going to start with that. I'm just going to move down here so I have a little bit more room. So I have 8/20. I'm going to divide both by 2 because we said that they have the multiples of 2 in common. So 8 divided by 2, or how many times does 2 go into 8, is 4. 2 goes into 20 10 times. Well, now I look at 4 and tenths. I need to make sure that this is reduced to lowest terms. And I see that 4/10 could be reduced because they're both even numbers. So I could divide these by 2 again. So 4 divided by 2 and 10 divided by 2. So how many times does 2 go into 4? Well, twice. How many times does 2 go into 10? That would be 5. Okay, 2 and 5 are not even, so I can't reduce them by 2. Both 2 and 5 are prime numbers, so actually this means the only thing I could divide them by is 1, and that doesn't make any sense. So that means our answer here is 2/5. So now we still have to go back and do our last step, which is combining our whole number difference with our fraction difference. So we take the 3 and we take the 2/5 and we combine this together, and we see that our final answer should be 3 and 2/5. So the answer to 5 1/2 minus 2 1/10 is 3 and 2/5. Now I'm just going to use estimation to double check this answer. Okay, we know 5 minus 2 is definitely going to be 3. 1/2 minus 1/10. Well, 1/10 is a very small fraction. So if we're going to be subtracting something really small from a half, my answer should still be close to a half. So let's see, 2/5. Well, half of 5 is actually 2 1/2, and 2 is a little bit less, so that does make sense. So 3 and 2/5 is an answer that sounds reasonable and makes sense to this subtraction question. All right, so Mustangs and Red Hawks and Spartans, all of our 5th graders. This is your review of adding and subtracting mixed fractions. So after this video, you will find that there are 8 questions for you to answer on Canvas. And after you have submitted your answers to those 8 questions, double check. Make sure that you've also answered the park question. That was question number 1 on your math assignment for today. Good luck, and if you have any questions at all, don't forget to give me an email, and I'll see if I can help you out. Have a great day.